Record it in Blenders. Maybe we get Blenders sponsorship.
There we go. Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the cash flow memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
Let's start. I'm going to get through exhibits A, B, and C very quickly because really have too much new. C was changed to have more production, mostly from Russia and a little more from Saudi Arabia. And so surplus is up to 3.5 billion barrels per day. Demand is pretty flat. You'll see lots of publicity about demand. China not growing. If you look at Exhibit C, China is not growing. U.S. grows very little. Europe is flat. India grows a little. Other Asia, interestingly enough, seems flat. So growth in demand for oil is, like 1 billion barrels per day, not more. Then it comes down to supply. And the problem with supply is if sanctions come off Russia, there's more. Iran, I reduced to just 2.8 because when I was doing this last weekend, the news was that Russia was going to intervene in the discussions of sanctions, U.S. sanctions against Iranian oil. But since that time, the supreme leader in Iran has said no interest in dealing in those discussions. So I guess if next time I redo this, I'll take the Iranian barrels down a little. But it's basically looks like flat to lower oil prices. Natural gas, which is Exhibit B, production is definitely up by 3 Bs a day now. So the question is, how much more will it increase behind over and above the 105 Bs a day? And the answer is that it'll probably drop some more. Fortunately, the LNG facilities are coming on stronger. And in fact, the futures are behaving great. I mean, the remainder of this year, as of the end of last week, was 450 and 26 was 430. There's some months out there in the fives. So that's good. Power demand, there's all this publicity about power demand because of data centers. It doesn't look as though power demand year to date, through the middle of March, is doing much more than matching the demand increase the last couple of years. So despite all the publicity, it just seems to be kind of a steady increase from 21 to estimated 25. Exhibit A, the House did pass a continuing resolution through the end of this fiscal year, September 30, 25. They had one Republican defection, congressman from Kentucky named Massey. One Democrat, a congressman from Maine, voted with them. They won by 4 votes. Sometime before late Friday, the Senate has to approve it. A senator can get up and filibuster, which they don't even have to stand and do anymore. They can just say they're filibustering. They don't have to stand up in the Senate and read from books. It takes 60 votes to end a filibuster. So there'll have to be, I think there are 52 senators, there'll have to be 8 Democrat senators to vote against the filibuster. And that'll all happen in the next couple of days. It'll be kind of for people who like to watch politics, it'll have some drama. In terms of these numbers, it's not really feasible to make much of a dent in that $1.9 trillion budget for the fiscal year that we're 6 months through. But according to Michael Johnson, who's the speaker, the House will turn out all 12 bills, all 12 expenditure bills by like the middle of July, which incredibly, we haven't approved all 12 bills in probably a decade and a half or more. Now, he probably can keep that pledge to do all 12 expenditure bills rather than do these continuing resolutions. Whether or not the Senate can keep up with that is a question. But for anyone looking at the scene, that would be just a terrific development. Now, how much can they save? Because I think spending when the president supports it, it's probably going to be around the 7 trillion level, which if you take out interest is 6 trillion. We'll see, despite all of Elon Musk's activities, how much they will propose to reduce spending in the next fiscal year. As far as revenue goes, revenue's 5 trillion. And, the income tax will probably be up a little. The payroll taxes will be up a little. Corporate income tax. I mean, if you look at the pattern over the last few years, it might come in 5.2 or 5.3, something like that. So the progress, if the goal is to reduce the budget deficit by half, will have to come on spending. Hard to imagine that you won't have to go after where the money is. That's defense is around 900 billion. That's Social Security, where maybe there's, all those Social Security recipients who are 150 years old, maybe there's some saving there. Medicaid, which is payments out to the states, I think a lot will happen there. That all should be worked on and done by the middle of the summer, so that by the start of the next fiscal year, we actually have a budget rather than a series of continuing resolutions. I'd like to go directly to the chip page, because there was news yesterday that Intel might be working on a project with Taiwan Semiconductor, where Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, in partnership with NVIDIA, Advanced Micro Devices, and Broadcom, would be acquiring Intel's fab capacity. Unclear whether it's all their fab capacity or just their high-end fab capacity. Jason, what's your guess? Would it be everything or just their attempt to try to match TSMC on 3 nanometer modes or whatever the leading edge is?
That's a good question. I feel like that list of companies is only really going to be interested in the leading edge. But I'd have to double check. I still believe Intel does a lot of business in the trailing edge as well. So what happens to that? The only natural fit is Broadcom in that list, but I don't know if they need extra capacity there. That's something like China plays in, and they're driving the cost down of those legacy chips. So they'd be hard pressed to acquire a fab and then make those chips profitably.
Mike made an interesting point this morning when we were talking about it. He said that if you start to work on fabs outside the United States, because presumably Intel's leading edge is mostly in Arizona.
Yeah, Arizona. Maybe it's in Ohio as well.
I think they've kind of paused the work there. So it's the 18A fab in Arizona, which is the one of most interest.
And
that's considered strategically important for the federal government in the United States. So I think that's where the focus is. It's the question is, you end up with antitrust issues if you're going to carve out the entire fab business, right? Because you have to get the EU to agree to it. You end up with a lot of complications.
Even if they agree, and maybe the latest fabs aren't set up this way, but Intel historically sets them up for their own production. So they're not set up to be contract fabs where they're going to make chips on demand to order from outside customers. So I would imagine there's a lot of retooling that would have to go on in these fabs, and that's not a cheap endeavor.
Yeah, they actually design a lot of their own hardware. But the reporting on the deal assumes that it includes nodes from Intel 7 on, which would be a lot of the international ones. So we'll see this thing play out. I think this is like anything that happens during this administration. You kind of have to wait a few days or weeks and see what actually happens versus what's talked about or rumored. It's an interesting scenario, though, because it is sort of strategic for Taiwan Semiconductor as well. And that was part of Hunt and I's conversation this morning, is having, a toehold in leading edge capacity in a joint venture in the U.S. provides them some strategic advantage as well.
Absolutely.
Well, TSMC has spent almost as much money in Arizona as Intel has with the fab, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know whether that is down to the 2 or 3 nanometer, or whether it's, a generation behind, because isn't it the case that TSMC has some kind of an arrangement with the government of Taiwan to do their latest generation in Taiwan only? Or is that rumored and not written down somewhere?
I don't know if it's written down, but that's definitely what TSMC does. They've said their all latest development happens in Taiwan.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a hard agreement or just an agreement among, they get a lot of special preferred treatment. I mean, you could say that the most important person in Taiwan is actually the CEO of Taiwan Semiconductor. It is such an outsized influence on their economy that they matter so much. But with the fears that they have there right now of China potentially making a move there, there's a lot of logic for both parties, both the Taiwanese government and for Taiwan Semiconductor, to allow this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Jason, I have a question for you. If the lineup, as reported, is NVIDIA and AMD and Broadcom, where's Apple? Why isn't Apple such a large customer of TSMC that you'd expect them to be part of the lineup of partners with?
I've got that question on several levels. Where is Apple? I think they're happy to just order the chips and not have to focus on actual manufacturing.
I think it's them appeasing China, because they're so dependent on China for the production of their iPhones that participating in this deal would do more harm than good. Yeah, like the favor curried with the U.S. would not be sufficient to offset maybe pissing off China. I don't know. That's speculation, but
yeah.
No.
I guess I'm kind of surprised AMD and NVIDIA would want to get in chip production. They're extremely successful just being a fabless chip manufacturer.
I think it's more strategic of having another source for leading edge that isn't in as geopolitically controversial location. But we're talking about one node, right? You also have to say, is this node going to keep getting iterated on? Or maybe the big picture is Taiwan Semiconductor has actually sort of shifted their production. They've historically, they build out a fab and they depreciate it out, and they continue to operate the fab for cash flow. Now, later in the years, it doesn't produce as much cash, but it's producing whatever amount of cash over basically zero depreciation. So all they have is a very minimal marginal cost of labor, which for chip production is relatively minor. In recent years, they have instead been upgrading their fabs. And this is the Intel model. So Intel would basically build the exact same fab in a bunch of different places throughout the world, because they would supply so many chips that they actually built the buildings, the fabs, to be identical to the point where square foot for square foot, location of bathrooms, everything is identical. Kind of interesting. And what they would do is just upgrade the equipment every year. The problem with that going into EUV is you actually have to design the fab around the equipment. The equipment, the EUV lithography equipment, especially the high-NA EUV lithography equipment, actually requires highly specialized building. You have all this, maybe the floor has 20-foot ceilings or whatever, but you also need a subspace below with 10-foot ceilings to handle a lot of stuff going below, and then similar setup on the floor above in order to handle the systems that all surround it. So the long story short is it is much harder to do what Intel was doing 2024. So all we can do is speculate as to what their aim is, but I guess Intel needs to get this fab part off of their books. It's clearly a huge drain. There's only one company in the world that's really capable of running fabs efficiently, and that's Taiwan Semiconductor. So I'm guessing this gets done at a sweetheart deal. If it gets done at a sweetheart deal for Taiwan Semiconductor. And I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't know the ability of someone like Samsung in order to come in and get it done, but they've been struggling at the more advanced nodes as well. So if Intel does figure it out, that's an asset that could be appealing to them.
Right. Mike and I were speculating on how much money would be involved. I guess we decided that it wouldn't be that much cash because Intel's done all kinds of, kind of off-balance sheet financing to help, as well as taking, a loan from the CHIPS Act. But I mean, if you look at the Intel balance sheet, it only shows $46 billion of debt. But I think a more proper accounting is quite a lot more from people like Brookfield and whatnot that made deals that to help Intel finance its facilities in Arizona. Remember, they were going to have a facility in Germany, and I think they pulled out of that. And Mike may be right on Ohio. They may have moved some dirt around, but they may be in a position where, despite commitments made to the U.S. government, to the Biden administration on the CHIPS Act, they may kind of defer indefinitely Ohio. Then the focus would be on their new facilities with the ASML equipment in Arizona. Happens that TSMC's put most of their money into Arizona as well, so there may be some benefits to having those two new fabs to run 2 or 3 nanometer. It may be an advantage to have them in the same state. Or how would that look to you, Jason?
Could certainly be an advantage. I mean, TSMC's campus in Taiwan is, all these fabs are next door to each other, so they get a lot of their suppliers to have offices and factories there as well. So the concentration of just knowledge and manufacturing semiconductors is all in one place, and they can literally walk across the street to ask questions of the engineers that maybe built the equipment that's in their fab. So it could very well be the same case that they're going for that in Arizona as well.
Right. They have to inculcate in their U.S. employees in Arizona the same kind of work ethic in Taiwan, which is these are graduate engineers, oftentimes qualifying for doctorates, but when the yield somehow screws up, they're on the site until further notice. And if they're having trouble hiring in U.S. engineers who were willing to make that same commitment, building the workforce, maybe half of it imported from Taiwan and half of it educated in the U.S. might be handy to have the facilities near each other.
Yeah, I just looked it up. They're probably a 30-minute drive away from each other. So,
okay, let's take a quick break for a message from Oak Cliff Sailing.
From Foiling Week through an entire week plus down in Pensacola. We had a crazy adventure, a lot of sailing, a lot of great conditions, and also some warm weather too, which was a benefit. We're here right by our NACRA 20. We've been training for the past few months on a bunch of different boats. Tell us about the boats that we've been on, Ewan.
So I've been out on the NACRA 20, the NACRA 15, and the UFO. NACRA 20 is a 3-point foiling 20-foot catamaran made by NACRA. The NACRA 15 is a 15-foot catamaran used in the youth classes and youth Olympic development. And the UFO is a small catamaran. It's about 6 feet long, and it foils kind of like a wasp. in Pensacola, they had the Foiling Film Festival, where they showed a bunch of cool different films from offshore to foil boarding through channels in Hawaii, all sorts of cool stuff. The Mardi Gras parade happened to be going on at the same time as Foiling Week. They had over 120 floats. There was all sorts of people dressed up, all sorts of beads. It was a whole big thing. They closed down all the streets. It was really, really cool.
One of the most memorable parts was we're foiling into the leeward mark, and there's this boat just to when we're trying to foil down, get mark room, and look back as we're giving them room, and all of a sudden we watch them do a crazy jibe, and the crew just get fully ejected out the back. And the whole time they were telling us that the birdie fish is very stable, doesn't capsize, and we just watched the crew just get absolutely launched out of it. Was definitely the foiling jibes, especially the last day, the last race. We nailed a foiling jibe onto the ley line to the leeward mark, foiled around the leeward mark as we're doing a sail swap, stayed up on the foils, and then continued going upwind at about 15 knots on the foils all the way up to the ley line, and then tacked, then went into the finish, and we probably finished that race almost a leg in front of everyone else, and that was really
And now back to the show.
Right. What else do we see in news on chips and software? We got to save some time. We're got about 7 minutes left. We got to save some time for healthcare.
So there's a lot. What are your top things that are not healthcare to cover, Jason? Because
I confess, I was at a tennis tournament, the last few days. So all I've been seeing is news about tariffs are on, tariffs are off, tariffs are doubled.
Well, OpenAI has released a bunch of new stuff. There's been so much AI stuff in the last 2 weeks that it's all sort of gotten to the point where the thing's moving so fast that it's hard to stay on top of the latest stuff. The most recent thing is OpenAI has released essentially a tool, a better API for building agents. So basically these are tools that developers can use to build AI into their products. These are maybe slower to gain revenue traction, but over the long term end up being probably more sticky than a typical consumer subscriber to ChatGPT. So that is helpful mainly because one of the challenges, and Jason could probably explain this from a software perspective, but one of the challenges with these AI models is you just have to pass all the information to them every time in the old way. And this new API will allow them to maintain state. So they don't have to, essentially it'll make the response times much faster. It'll have to be stored on OpenAI servers, but it's going to work much better for the developers.
I guess other AI news, Apple has announced that they're suspending upgrades of Apple Intelligence in the next generation of Siri indefinitely. And the rumor is that product will not come out until 2027. So we're talking a 2-year delay from this point, and that's a huge head start to give competition. And we know the competition is not just Google. There's at least 2 other companies building AI-focused smartphones that have not, come public with a product. One of them is Perplexity's rumored product, and then the other is a venture started by Johnny Ive, who helped develop the iPhone along with Sam Altman. So there's real money and real engineering talent behind a couple competitors potentially to Apple.
And the last thing that I've got is Memphis. XAI's Memphis campus is expanding with another 1 million square feet in the area with the intent to bring 1 million GPU cluster online. So the pace is not slowing down, that's for sure.
No. Jason, what about healthcare news before we run out of runway here?
Yeah, the most interesting thing to me was a new invention by Roche. It's a gene sequencing tool. So there's a couple ways to do gene sequencing. PacBio and Illumina, to greatly simplify it, uses markers that illuminate each base, the base in the DNA that is picked up by a camera or an optical sensing device. And that is a slow process, but a very accurate process. There's another process developed out of Oxford that they call, it's nanopore. And again, to simplify it, you're essentially, you're passing a chain of DNA through a small protein pore that emits an electrical signal when it's stimulated, depending on which base pair is inside of the pore at the time. So you can pass a lot more of the DNA through this sequencing tool a lot faster, but it's less accurate. The advantage to this versus say PacBio's is you can run a sequencing at 1/10 of the cost. But the trade-off is less accuracy. And that's due to the size of the actual base in the genetic sequence. It's a couple atoms wide. So it's hard to make every reading accurately. And what Roche did was, and I won't do it justice on their website. They've posted a video that explains this, but they essentially have, the pairings to each base, and then between the pairings that attach to the genetic sequence, there's, what do they call it? An expandomere. So it is kind of like a thread, a loop that connects each one. And then when you separate that from the original DNA sequence, you can expand those threads and allow the chain of base pairs to be about 50 times the length. And you pass those through the nanopore, and it can much more accurately read each one because now there's more space between them. No word on the cost. They just announced this about a week ago. But in theory, it could, again, be a step change, bringing down the cost of genetic sequencing.
Because they're using the same sort of process that's being done by the product that's in market for reading these chains, that is an order of magnitude cheaper than your traditional Illumina or PacBio methods.
Correct.
So I think it's super interesting and maybe a little in the weeds for everything, but
yeah,
I think we'll be doing more genome sequencing in the future, not less.
Yeah.
Mhm. How's RFK Jr. doing during his first couple of weeks after getting confirmed?
Well, the latest thing, this one's sort of interesting. He's changing the way in which the FDA kind of deals with these non-food substances in our foods. Typically, you think like Doritos. Not everything in Doritos grows in nature, as you might imagine. So there's maybe chemicals in there of certain sorts that are believed to be safe in humans. And the process by which they notify the FDA is going to be changed under RFK Jr., which, without going too far in the weeds, the big point is they're going to be putting a lot more scrutiny on the non-food substances that end up in our food. And hopefully that dispels some of the concerns people have had about an RFK Jr., his views maybe slowing down science or not listening to science. They're actually ratcheting up what they're looking at, especially when it comes to the food supply. So we think this is pretty positive. I mean, unless you're Mondelez or one of the food companies that's likely going to be on the brunt end of this, but it's I think it's well in line with everything that he said that he's been planning to do.
Right. Jason, anything new on Lantheus or Vertex Pharmaceutical or Harrow?
A potential competitor to Vertex's non-opioid pain treatment emerged in the last week. They announced results of a phase 1 study. So very early stages, and it's phase 1's a safety study. So they gave this to healthy volunteers. And then from there, they assessed them on their pain tolerance. So they weren't already injured when they, and I don't know how they assess their pain tolerance, but there's definitely a high potential for placebo effect and that kind of thing. But it's something to look out for. Many years away from the market, though.
Right. And so far as we can tell, that Vertex Pharmaceutical is now authorized to start selling their medicine. I think you mentioned in one of the recent Wednesdays through hospitals.
Correct. Yeah. And another big bit of news is OptumRx has authorized them on their plan. So they're starting to get reimbursements lined up.
Right. Good. Just in a minute or two left, we haven't talked about Tesla. So this is one of the few Wednesdays recently we talked about Tesla. One thing I think we learned is that Tesla will not be using as much of the Memphis capacity as we thought it might. In fact, I think Mike dug up some information that the FSD, full self-driving, is going to be run through a data center in Texas rather than.
That's right.
Right.
That's the Cortex data center. It has 50,000 H100s today. Recently, Musk has said that total data center will cost about $5 billion once completed. And he referred to it as Cortex 1, which implies that there will also be a Cortex 2.
And that's surprising to me because I would think the bigger data centers would be the training place for video.
Well, I did look into that. And since you missed our Tuesday call,
Yeah.
I'll have to fill you in next Tuesday.
They're not swearing off using Memphis, are they, Mike?
It's not clear, but it seems like XAI has more than enough on its plate that they've got plans to utilize all of Memphis.
Yeah. But wasn't there, probably in a, not news, but kind of rumored news that Tesla was contributing some money towards Memphis? But
yes, there was. And that's where I was confused about it as well. That was so early on. It was kind of pre the project. So it's very likely that got sort of snubbed by investors, or maybe it was decided that it wasn't the right way to structure it. I know that he does share engineering talent among his companies, and that's probably useful and enables them to flex up and flex down as they need additional bodies. But it seems like the XAI Memphis data center is going to go exclusively to Grok and XAI projects.
right. Well, in any event, we will have some more time on Tesla next week, in exactly 7 days from now. In the meantime, everyone be well and stay healthy, and we'll be back in exactly 7 days. Take care, everyone.
The views expressed on this podcast are the hosts alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future, and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.